What's going on, everybody? Today we're going to talk about personal sin. And the first thing we need here is a definition. Personal sin is an action, word, or desire contrary to God's law. Okay? Personal sin, action, word, or desire against or contrary to God's law. Second point is a human action. Okay? Personal sin is a reality, it's not an idea, it's a human action. And when I say human here, I refer to the fact that it requires the exercise of freedom. Okay? If there is no freedom, there is no sin. If there is no freedom, there is no love for God either. We need to exercise our freedom in order to do good things or in order to do bad things. When we decide freely to do something contrary to God's law, then we are committing a sin. And it is a human action because we have our freedom in use when we commit a sin, okay? So, action, word, desire, contrary to God's law, that we do freely, it's a human action. Then, of course, sin is always evil. What happens when we commit sin is that we say to God, sorry God, what you said that I have to do is not the way to be happy. I'm gonna decide my own way to be happy. So by doing so, we are telling God, God, you don't know what's the way for me to be happy, so you are wrong, so I'm gonna put you aside and I'm gonna decide my ways to be happy that are better than yours. So that opposition to God, who is our creator and our father, who gave us the rules to play the game because he knows how it works, when we oppose God in that way, we are doing something evil, okay? Sin is always evil. And finally, as St. Augustine says, sin is aversio a Deo et conversio ad creaturas. Okay, this is St. Augustine. Aversio a Deo means we run away from God. We put God behind. We put God aside, if you like. We run away from God and we turn towards creatures. We place in creatures the happiness that we should place in God. So, personal sin, 4 things. An action, word, a desire, contrary to God's law. That is a human action because we use our freedom. Then it's always evil because we set the rules as we go when we commit sin and we decide, no, this is the way to be happy, not the way God told me that was the right one to be happy. And finally, sin is that aversio a Deo et conversio ad creaturas. Now, let's talk about mortal sin and venial sin. Mortal sin, let us put it this way, is the death of the soul. And venial sin is the sickness of the soul. Why? Mortal sin is the death of the soul because it cancels sanctifying grace in our hearts. Okay? It totally cancels sanctifying grace in our lives, in our souls. Whereas venial sin doesn't cancel totally grace in our hearts. Then there are 3 requirements for an action to be considered a mortal sin, okay? And those requirements are grave matter, full knowledge, and full consent. These are the three requirements for an action to be a mortal sin. Okay? That action that is gonna be the death of the soul because it's gonna cancel totally God's grace in our hearts. So grave matter, okay, it's gotta be grave matter. Stealing $1 to your sister is not grave matter. But premarital sex, going for abortion or asking for medical assistance in dying, or masturbation, or evading taxes, systemically evading taxes in your life, that's a mortal sin, okay? So those are the things we're talking about. Grave matter. There is no grave matter, there is no mortal sin. So this is one of the things, one of the requirements. Second requirement, full knowledge, okay? Full knowledge means realization, okay? The key word here is realization. Realization of the fact that if I do this action, I know that this is an action that is bad, okay? Realization of the fact that the action carried out is a bad action. That's what we mean when we say full knowledge. We are talking about realization. Realization of the fact that the carried action is bad because it's contrary to God's law, okay? Full consent means that one wants to carry this action that is contrary to God's law, and one makes a decision and goes for it with awareness, etc. So that's the thing. There is full consent when one openly wants to commit an action that one knows is contrary to God's law. In order to commit a mortal sin, it is not necessary just to be willing to offend directly God. Okay? That's not needed to commit a mortal sin. To commit a mortal sin, what is needed is to be willing to carry an action which we know is contrary to God's law. Okay? And again, three requirements. Grave matter, full knowledge, full consent, and that's it. So, what happens if we commit a mortal sin? Here it is. Consequences. Or effects of mortal sin. First one, we lose charity. So loss of charity. Second one, loss of sanctifying grace. Third one, exclusion from Christ's kingdom. The next one is hell. Then something that happens is when we commit mortal sin, we lose access to sacramental communion, okay? Because it is not possible to desire at the same time both being totally separated from God and at the same time to be willing to receive Him in communion. It's not possible. So we cannot desire at the same time both things, to receive sacramental communion and to decide to live far away from God because of the mortal sin. So, let's say here, privation from receiving sacramental communion. Okay? And then, number 6, we lose unity with Christ's mystical body. Loss of unity with Christ mystical body. That is the church. So even though we still belong to the church, if we commit a mortal sin, that mortal sin causes a loss of unity with Christ's mystical body. That is the church. Okay, so we are members of the church, but if you like, we are weak members of the church. Then there is loss of merits. 7. Loss of merits. That means what we had done right, that was helping us to make it to heaven, is totally lost, okay? But we can recover it through confession, of course. Number 8. The natural desire to do good fades. Next, the person becomes subject to the devil's power. And finally, disorder in our actions and desires increases. That's it. And now, what are the consequences of venial sin? Effects of venial sin. So first one, it diminishes charity. Charity, that is the virtue that joins us to God, right? Second one, it slows down the progress in our spiritual life. Third point, it introduces a disordered love for created goods. Then it merits temporal punishment. Mortal sin merited hell, that is forever. Venial sin, it merits temporal punishment. Then venial sin, of course, sets us in occasion to commit mortal sin. If you like, it predisposes us to commit mortal sin. I mean, if those venial sins are repeatedly present there in our lives and we don't do anything to cut them out, okay? And finally, it increases our lukewarmness. And rather than being fervent Catholics, we are lukewarm Catholics. Because I don't care about these small things, I don't care about this laziness, I don't care about this lack of charity, I don't care about these things. So little by little, we give into lukewarmness, because venial sin leads us towards that direction. And venial sin, finally, it doesn't break our covenant with God, which is why we can still receive sacramental communion if we have venial sin. The remedy for these sins, venial and mortal sins, the remedy is confession, okay? For mortal sin, there is no other way. If you commit a mortal sin, you gotta go to confession for that sin to be forgiven. There is no other way, okay? The only way to forgive a mortal sin is to go to confession. The church teaches that it's mandatory to go to confession to receive the forgiveness of our mortal sins, and the church recommends the confession of venial sins. Venial sins can be also forgiven can be forgiven if we do penance, if we say an act of contrition, if we say an act of atonement, if we offer up to the Lord mortifications. All those things clean and forgive our venial sins. Again, the church recommends that we bring up in confession our venial sins. Okay, that would be the way for our venial sins to be forgiven. The case of the mortal sin is totally different. In order to get the forgiveness of our mortal sins, we need to go to confession. Now, let us say something about the fundamental option. It rejects the traditional distinction between venial and mortal sin. According to the people who support this theory, there could be mortal sin only if there were an act of radical and total opposition against God, if there were a fundamental option against Him, okay? In order to have a mortal sin, according to these people, there's gotta be a fundamental option against God that you make with your decision, etc., okay? But according to this theory, it is almost impossible to fall into mortal sin in the course of our daily choices, because a person's freedom in its ordinary exercise of choice is not able to make this fundamental option against God, okay? So there are faults, they say, that could be exceptions in an overall upright life, okay? So those exceptions in an overall upright life would be just no big deal, okay? Because my life is an upright life overall, right? So those faults wouldn't be something super important. They would be exceptions, okay? And these guys who believe in this theory, the fundamental option, they justify grave faults by saying it was just a failure to live up to one's Christian life, nothing else, no big deal. The problem with this theory is that they undermine the power of our freedom, and they deny the fact that a person has the power of commitment and to make decisions in our daily lives. According to the theory of the fundamental option, there would be only three kinds of sins. Venial, okay, the ones we know, there is no grave matter, etc. Then there could be grave sins and mortal sins. Okay? The mortal sin would be the real, radical, fundamental option against God. Okay? There could be actually only one mortal sin. That would be this one. My radical and fundamental option against God. Okay? If someone got here, that person would be committing a mortal sin. That would be, according to these guys, the real mortal sin. Then there would be grave sins. Those things you do, but no big deal, because if you haven't made this radical decision, those things are just small failures. These ones would be grave matter. Okay, grave matter, grave sins, grave matter. But if you didn't make your radical and fundamental option against God, those failures are, those actions are just failures, but no big deal. Okay. And venial is venial matter. Okay? That would be more or less the thing. By this theory, these guys introduce here all the sins against the sixth commandment. For instance, they would say, if you never made your radical option against God, these sins against chastity, etc., they are just small failures, no big deal. That's what they say, unfortunately. Okay? And venial matter, they understand by that, and by venial sin, what we understand by venial sin. So this is more or less this, the fundamental option that is totally wrong. And now let us say something about other divisions or classification, if you like, of sins that occur in the teaching of the Catholic Church. Okay, so there are sins of omission and commission. Okay, the sin of omission is when you don't do something. Okay, commission is when you do something wrong. Okay, then there is the internal or the external. Okay, stealing something is an external sin because you can see it by your senses, right? Internal would be to have impure thoughts or to have thoughts of pride, okay? Because you don't see those thoughts of pride with your senses, with your external senses, okay? So internal sins, external sins, omission when you don't do something and you should, okay? Commission when you do something that is positively evil, okay? Then there is actual sin, that could be the act of sinning, and then there is the habitual sin. That would be the stain left in the soul by actual sin. Okay? Then there is carnal sin versus spiritual sin. The carnal sin is committed and is related to something you can touch, a good of this creation that is presented as good for you. Okay? For instance, gluttony, or for instance, lust. All these things are carnal because the sin is related to something you can touch and do, etc. Whereas the spiritual sin is more, in the spiritual side, right? For instance, thoughts of pride. Carnal, you see that lust or that gluttony. Actual, the fact when you commit a sin. Habitual, the stain that is left in the heart when you commit a sin. External, you can see it by your external senses. Internal, you cannot see it by your external senses. Okay? You see it by your internal senses. Omission, you stop doing something that you should be doing. Commission, you do something that you shouldn't be doing. Okay? And finally, there is personal sin versus original. Okay, the original sin is the one all of us are born with, and personal are the sins that I have committed. Okay, that are different than the sins you have committed. Okay, so personal is my personal sin. Original is the tendency all of us have to commit sin because we see that evil is attractive because we are wounded by original sin. Okay, so all these are the divisions. Of course, all of them, all the sins can be explained in these deadly sins, right? There are 7, right? That is gluttony, pride, lust, greed, etc. And now let us explain something about temptations, okay? Sin doesn't come out of the blue. Usually there is a temptation. That's why we need to know something about temptations in order to battle sin properly. Temptations. Temptation, let us say it briefly, is incitement to sin. Okay, that would be a short definition of temptation. Traditionally, in the history of the church, the magisterium of the church has explained these temptations in three groups: world, devil, and flesh. Let's start with the flesh. Flesh meaning our tendency towards sin, concupiscence. Concupiscence is this tendency all of us have towards sin. We somehow, because we are wounded by original sin, we somehow see some good in sin, and we feel tempted to do it, even though we know, because we know the Ten Commandments, we know that we shouldn't go there, but we see it still something as attractive. So that's the temptation of the flesh. The flesh, that concupiscence, that tendency all of us have towards sin. How can we battle this? The solution is mortification. Concupiscence brings me down, mortification brings me up. In front of temptations, the best solution is to offer up to others small mortifications. At table, mortifications. At work, mortifications in our dealings with others. Temperance in the use of created goods, etc. If we work on that, when temptation comes, we have been trained to overcome it. So, the flesh. Flesh is the temptation that comes from within, so to speak. And we have the power to say no, because we are free. Then, temptations of the devil. The devil is constantly trying to take us away from God. And he brings up suggestions. Why? Well, God allows the devil to tempt. To tempt us. But we have the power to say no again. And the devil never has the power to lead us to commit the temptation. It is us who freely decide to go there. But we have the power at the same time to say no. So the devil brings up these temptations. And the solution against these temptations is prayers. The devil invites us to do wrong actions. Suddenly, out of the blue, you come up with this bad idea to do something wrong. That's the temptation of the devil, And we battle this by saying prayers. And then the world. The world as a temptation is that the aspects of this world that are led by sin. This is not a temptation that comes from my heart. This is not a temptation that comes from the devil. It's a temptation that comes from the world that is already wounded by sin. For instance, in the world you see a lot of glamour. So that's the temptation that the world is bringing up to you. And you have to avoid it by turning back to its original meaning, this world. And in order to enjoy in a party, we don't need lots of glamour, right? So we have to bring back to this world its original meaning. If there is party, we party in a sense that is pleasing to God. Not that in a sense that can lead us to temptation. So the world. The idea would be to transform the world from within. People who are far away from God party in a bad way because they create occasions to offend God in those parties. If you organize a party and you're a Christian, you organize that party in a way that is going to be good for people and there's not going to be occasion to sin. That's the way we transform the world from within, because we are in the middle of the world. And now, before we finish this class, let us say something about occasions of sin. And the word here is flee. If you flee from the occasion of sin, you will have one problem less in your life. So flee from the occasions of sin. There are proximate occasions of sin and there are remote occasions of sin. So the idea is these ones are right now, right here, okay? This thought of, for instance, proximate occasion of sin would be just to, to say to yourself, I'm gonna waste some time now because I'm tired, okay? Wasting time. It's a proximate occasion of sin, because when we waste time, we do nothing and all sorts of things can appear. We give the opportunity to the devil to bring us some temptations, etc. So, proximate occasion of sin, wasting time, or just surfing the internet without any specific purpose, all those things are proximate occasions of sin. And again, we have to cut them out, we have to flee from them. And then there is the remote. The remote occasion of sin might not be right now, right here, but we have to stay away. For instance, to make a decision, if you are boyfriend and girlfriend, you have to make a decision not to go all the weekend, you both alone, in a lost cottage in the mountains, because you know what's going to happen. So, to make those remote occasions of sins, to stay away from them. And that's it.